I'm Rachel Reid. I'm a midwife, an academic, a researcher, author and speaker. And I was a private practice midwife for many years in Australia, and I've worked in the UK as well. So rites of passage are transitions, and they happen throughout everybody's life. Even just a transition, graduating from a degree is a rite of passage to some extent. And women, we have female bodies, and we have rites of passage, which are transitions from one part of our life into another that are physical. So we have menarche, where we start bleeding and come into womanhood. And childbirth is one of the female rites of passage that has a bodily element. So we have that physiology that augments what happens during a rite of passage. And it's happening on a physical level, but it's also happening very much on a personal, who you are level. So the childbirth rite of passage is about transitioning into motherhood. And even if you've got children, it's motherhood of this child. And during a rite of passage, and this is an anthropological term that goes way back, looking at rites of passage in all kinds of cultures. But in a rite of passage, there are phases that the person progresses through, which is the separation from their current status, and then this space that's the liminal space that's in between, and then at the end of that, the integration of the new status. So women who are having babies are going through those phases. Regardless of whether they acknowledge them, it's happening. And during those phases, we can support those phases, because ultimately what we're wanting is a woman to come out feeling empowered. And when I talk to roomfuls of midwives, I often ask the same question, which is, what do you want a woman to know at the end of her childbirth rite of passage? And pretty much it's the same thing. Wherever I say, doulas, midwives, student midwives say the same thing. Want the woman to know that she's strong, that she's powerful, that she's got it, that, to feel empowered. All of those words come up. And then it's a case of, okay, so what are we saying and doing that's transmitting to that to her during her rite of passage? Are we saying to her that she's got this, to trust herself? Or are we saying to her, I'll tell you, whether your baby's well, and I'll be the external expert here. So this transition into motherhood is a really key time for women to grow. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a fantastic experience for a woman to grow. Often women grow from a childbirth rite of passage that was not what they wanted or expected. And then there's huge transformative growth and lessons learned from that then they take into the next childbirth rite of passage. So looking at childbirth as a rite of passage just allows us to acknowledge that there's something far more going on than just babies coming out of women, that this is a hugely transformative experience for the woman. Her entire status shifts, and with the whole family changes when another baby comes or a new baby comes, that there's something far greater going on. And it allows us to acknowledge that, and then to ensure that what we're saying and doing around that woman is supporting that transformation in the direction that we want it to go, which is that she knows that she can do this, and that she's amazing, and that she can mother this baby, and that she's really connected into her intuition and trusting herself. So I think looking at birth as a rite of passage just helps us look at it as a holistic experience rather than just an event where a baby comes out of a woman's body. And home birth always was part of that rite of passage. Birth has always occurred in women's homes or in the community, in a birth hut or a home nearby, and surrounded by women. And midwives have been around since the beginning of time. They're written about in Egyptian times. And the role of the midwife was to oversee, so not to necessarily be overly involved, but to watch and to be there if things deviated and intervene if necessary. And women were primarily cared for by other women. So women that they knew, their mothers, their sisters, women in the community. So that was birth until fairly recently. And then birth moved into hospitals not that long ago, and midwifery came under medicine. So it's just a very, very different setup. So caring for a woman at a home birth as a midwife is very different to caring for a woman in a hospital setting, because you know the woman and you're on her territory. So automatically the power shifts a little. You very much are there as an observer, and hopefully you're not needed. And most of the time you're not. You're just observing and providing care and not intervening. Whereas in a hospital setting, you don't know the woman, and you have other people watching what you're doing, which alters how you practice. So what we do and say to women during birth and during the childbirth rite of passage influences their transformation. So I think we really need to think about what it is we say and do and what messages are being transmitted to the woman through that, regardless of the setting of birth. And it's a lot easier to transmit the message that the woman is the expert and that she has the power when she's in her territory and you're a visitor than it is when you're in the role of the external expert using your technology and machines to bring in your expertise to monitor her physiological birth. So it just shifts kind of how you practice and what messages are transmitted to women. Yeah, so the physiology of birth, we've lost it. We've forgotten what it's about. The textbooks are wrong. You know, so the central focus is on a uterus and a cervix opening and a baby coming out, when really the physiology of birth is hormonal. And hormones are influenced by state of mind, what's happening around you in the environment. So the incomings, I call it, influence how the hormones work, which then influence how the body works. So if we think about women and their safe place, so in order for the hormones to work well, women need to feel safe. And you know, birth is unpredictable and there's no getting around that, and it's okay to feel a little bit kind of wary around that, but you need to feel that you're in a safe place where you have help if you need it and where you have people who care for you. So that is really what supports and promotes physiology. But we've lost it in terms of we're looking at what interventions we can do to improve physiology, when in fact it's just about keeping out of the way and ensuring the woman feels safe and respected, and physiology will work. So it's more difficult in a hospital setting to promote physiology simply because you're disrupting and interfering with the woman's hormones. So there's a lot more incomings. So you're interacting a lot more with the woman. She's in an environment that even if she feels logically, rationally safe, her nervous system knows that this is not an environment that it knows. And you know when you go into other people's homes or other places, there's that certain edge that comes about. So that's happening in a setting that the woman isn't familiar with. It doesn't happen at home. She's in a setting she feels comfortable in. It's her setting. She has people around her. So the incomings are minimal and they're supporting and promoting her nervous system, which then influences the hormones, which influences physiology. Whereas in a hospital setting, you have to really work a little bit harder to do that. And you see that when women come into hospital in really good, powerful labour, and it all just fizzles. And that's actually expected and normal. And we expect that as when you're working in a hospital setting, you expect that the labour will fizzle out when the woman comes in for a little bit. And then you have to create the environment to get it relaxed to go again. So when you're in a home setting, you haven't got that interruption that stimulates your neocortex. And the neocortex is great for early labour because it helps you get things sorted out, because it's the active part of your brain, so you can get your home set up, you can call in who you need. But you actually need that to shut down and to really be birthing from that primitive part of your brain, which is the limbic system. So you're trying to not engage the neocortex, that clever thinking part of the brain, which is difficult to do when you're traveling into a place you haven't been before and you're meeting people who you might not have seen before, who are asking you questions like, how often are your contractions coming? All these very rational questions. It's expected that that's going to interfere with the oxytocin release, because once your neocortex is functioning and your adrenaline and cortisol is going, it's going to dampen oxytocin. So it's expected your contractions will fade off until you get back into that space where you can feel safe and shut down that neocortex. Most women will have a variation to the standard, if you like, because there is no standard. And that's not well tolerated in a system that's set up around everybody being the same and managing women according to time frames rather than what's happening for their individual physiology. So in a home birth setting, the tolerance for variations is, it's an individual woman, and there will be variations. So women will labour for a lot longer than expected by norms, or a lot shorter. They will have babies in all kinds of interesting positions. And there's that real distinction between physiology and a variation. So a variation to physiology is a healthy, well woman and baby, that's just a variation to what is considered the norm, versus pathology, which is a complication or something going wrong. We tend to mix those up a lot. Whereas at home birth, what you're seeing is all of the variations of physiology. And they're very varied. You know, women take all kinds of lengths of time to birth their placenta. They make all kinds of noises. They do all kinds of different things. We're not checking the cervix, so who knows what's going on inside, because that doesn't tell us anything. So it's just a very different approach when you're at a home birth, and those variations you get to see. That was one of the biggest learning curves for me, stepping out of a hospital, primarily hospital birth, into home birth. Was women taught me so much about how birth could be, because I'd been taught a particular way, and in hospital setting you then make it happen that particular way. So if a woman's contractions are only every 5 minutes, then there would be an intervention to speed them up. At home we didn't do that, and a baby came out. So I learned that babies come out regardless of what the contraction pattern is doing. So it's just a very different tolerance, I guess, for variations. So the other important thing to consider is how we look at safety and risk. So in the modern context, we look at safety and risk very differently to how we previously have. So previously, if we look throughout history, when birth was happening outside of medicine, then risk was perceived to be arising from the environment that the woman was in. So a lot of what I call rites of protection, which are the actions that are performed and the words that are said to ensure safety, were around ensuring the environment was safe, or that the spiritual aspects were safe. So a lot of the traditional midwifery was around those aspects. And then in the medical frame, where we are now, we see the woman's body as the risk. So what we're doing is we're doing interventions to her body to protect her and her baby, not considering that the environment is actually the risk a lot of the time. So it's just a very different way of looking at safety and risk. And from a home birth perspective, people often say to me, oh, you must be brave. That's really risky to be in a home birth setting. From my perspective, I feel safer because I know a woman who's in her own environment, who's having a physiological birth, is so connected into her intuition that often she will identify and manage variations and complications before I even know they're happening. And I can remember one woman in particular who was having, it was a third, fourth baby, and she was having a very stop-start, labour, that variation. So she would labour in the night when her other kids were asleep, and then in the day it would all stop. And this went on for a couple of nights and days. And then when she birthed, she actually got herself into a very odd position. And I was kind of wanting to tell her to move, because she had her head on the ground and her bottom in the air. So she's upside down. So we're watching her push this baby out practically upside down, and thinking logically, from the outside, well, you just need to get upright and this baby will come out, because the baby's going uphill. But we didn't say anything, so I've learned not to say things. And this baby came out, and he came out with his placenta. And we'd seen a little bit of blood as his head had been born. So I think this woman hadn't had any scans. Looking back at what happened, that placenta was probably really close to the cervix. And her being upside down had taken the pressure off the placenta to allow the baby to come through. So she was looking after the safety of her baby with her intuition. She didn't know why she'd taken up that position. She just felt she needed to be in that position. And I've just seen that time and time again, women doing things that look really odd. And then afterwards you go, oh, that was totally the right thing to do. So for me, that's safety. Safety is a woman who's so deeply connected with her body and baby that she will know if there's something not right. She'll know how to fix it, or she will say, there's something not right and I need your help. So midwives need to acknowledge that they are an intervention. Sort of anybody who is there as an outsider at a birth is an intervention. And, interventions aren't all bad. Massage is an intervention. A lot of women really enjoy that intervention, and it can help to promote oxytocin. So it's not that all interventions are bad, but midwives need to consider themselves as an intervention in the birth space, and really consider what it is we say and do and how that influences. Because everything you say a word of reassurance as an intervention, but it may be a good one because it may help the woman to trust herself and relax again. And what we know is that what is said and done to a woman impacts her experience of birth and whether or not she has birth trauma. And the research that I did looking specifically at childbirth trauma, what we did was we asked, it ended up being over 700 women, just to describe what was traumatic about their birth. And it wasn't the, outcome, a really terrible outcome like a baby in special care or a massive hemorrhage or that kind of physical complication. They were in there, but 2/3 of these women told us that what was traumatic was what was said and done to them. So it was the way that people around them interacted with them and what they said. And that was what was perceived as traumatic and had the impact that is long term. And this is an impact that we don't count. So in a system, in a hospital system, for example, they will need to report how many hemorrhages, how many stillbirths, how many maternal deaths, all those really big physical outcomes that we don't want to happen. And we do need to collect that data. But what they're not collecting is 6 months down the track, the depression or the anxiety, the inability to mother as you would mother if you felt, healthy and well. That's not counted. And if those women do then go back into the system, they'll go through a GP or into mental health. So it doesn't become even a problem for the obstetric unit. They're not going to have to pick up those pieces. So, when we're looking at risk and outcomes for an individual woman, it looks very different to an organisation that's looking at that bigger picture and litigation and what's coming back into their system. But we know that home birth has better outcomes across the board for women in terms of physical outcomes and emotional mental health outcomes. And, birth can be an empowering experience regardless of how it unfolds. Even women who have very medicalized births can have really empowering experiences. But what you see in a physiological birth is an augmentation of that empowerment through hormones. So this huge dopamine release, this huge kind of after the adrenaline of that last bit of labor. So it all comes together to create an actual physically empowering, euphoric experience immediately after the birth, which is how physiological birth has been set up to do, to promote, ensure that you have healthy, well women who think they're amazing and can then look after their babies and feel confident doing that. That's how it's all been set up to do. What you often see with home birth is a huge sense of empowerment from the women who do it. And often these are women, though, who have had traumatic births or births that were not what they wanted in the system first. A lot of my clients, when I was a home birth midwife, they weren't women having their first babies, which would be great. There was women having their first babies, but they were often women who had had babies in the system. So they were coming out and wanting something different. And, there's always you have to work through that because there's always a little bit of trauma that comes along with that and anxiety around, will it be different? And when those women birth their babies at home, it's amazing. The sense of empowerment, everybody in the room is intoxicated with it. And that's one of the reasons I used to love looking after women having VBACs, because there was just that extra level of, yeah, you did it, and seeing that in their face. But that's a culture thing. Our entire culture is about making other people responsible and not actually owning anything. So that just translates into birth, where we're quite keen to hand over that responsibility. And we groom women throughout the whole antenatal period. The antenatal care was set up primarily, from the World War, where we'd lost so many men that we needed to have a healthy repopulation, I guess. So that's where it came in. It wasn't coming in to ensure women and babies had, a really great start to life where they were bonding together. That wasn't it. It was healthy, well babies being born out of women. So the surveillance was all about making sure that the baby was well, using external methods to do that. And we still see that. We still have all of the screening and the antenatal appointments are around checking the woman's body and the baby's well-being. That's it. That's what antenatal care is. Whereas, in a continuity of care experience as a midwife, then really, yes, you are doing those physical checks, but it's primarily about nurturing self-trust, because what you want at the end isn't a woman who thinks you're the external expert and needs to come to you to see if they're in labour and you to check that they're well, that they trust themselves to do that themselves. So by the time they go into labour, you can, as a midwife, feel safe because the woman trusts herself enough to listen to herself and to do what she needs to do. So it's just it's a different approach. So really antenatal care should be about nurturing that self-trust. And if we don't do that, then we can't be surprised that women need to get to hospital to make sure that they're in labour because they don't know themselves. They need somebody else to tell them that because all the way through their antenatal period, somebody else has told them how they're doing, whether their baby's well. So they're looking externally for that. So they're going to keep seeking that. And as a midwife, I always question myself if a woman says to me that she couldn't have done it without me. Then I question what was it that I did that made her think that I was that needed, that she couldn't have done it without me. I much prefer a woman to say, I'm amazing, I did this, thank you for being there. That is much more of a compliment to my practice. And, women often will birth before the midwife gets there. When you've got that continuity of care and the woman really trusts herself, then often the baby will arrive before the midwife because the woman doesn't feel the need to have a midwife there. And I know, from my perspective, women who then go on to maybe even choose free birth after having a home birth with a private practice midwife, that's a real testimony to how they really have learned how amazing they are and to trust themselves. Well, we know that when women have had a traumatic experience and have resulting mental health issues, we know that that impacts on relationships with her loved ones in her family, a partner, and it impacts on her capacity to mother and her relationship with the baby, which impacts on the baby's development and health. So we know that there's research quite clearly demonstrating that. So what we actually need to be doing as a maternity service is focusing on ensuring that women step into motherhood feeling strong and empowered and not traumatized and broken, and that they know that they are the expert in caring for their baby and that they are well supported in that and that they have the confidence to do that. The whole physiology of birth in that liminal phase, which is that in-between phase, is that your neocortex is switched off and your limbic system is really activated, which is your instincts and your animal kind of mammalian aspect. And that's what you need actually for physiology, but also that's that hypnotic state. So anything that's said and done might not look like it's registering, but it's actually going directly into the subconscious. So the things that are said to women when they're in labour, they may not even acknowledge them, externally, but they're going in deeply. And you ask women, they remember what was said to them during their birth for years. When I was doing my PhD and I was interviewing women about their birth experiences, and I had to go and find the research about, well, will they remember, and how can I, argue that women will remember clearly what happened during their birth and for how long. And the evidence was that actually women remembered for 30 odd years really clearly the things that were said and done to them during their birth, which makes sense when you think they're in this really open kind of hypnotic state in the physiology of birth, that we have to be really careful what we're planting in there.